Welcome to the Military Spouse Careers and Business Podcast, your source for in-depth information all about the job application, negotiation, transitioning, education processes, and the unique challenges and overcoming of those challenges experienced by military spouses. You'll hear inspiring stories from military spouses all over the world who have found a way to make their career work for them and not take a back seat. Thanks so much for tuning in. All right, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Circe Woessner. I'm an Army wife, an Army mom, and an overseas brat. I founded the Museum of the American Military Family after having a long career as a federal employee and as a teacher. I'm very happy to be here.
Hey, I'm so happy to have you. Why don't we start by talking about your connection to the military? How did that originally start?
Well, I was born overseas. My parents were DoD employees working with the Defense Department schools. And so I spent my childhood and early adulthood in Germany. And I met my husband over at the University of Maryland in Munich, and we got married. And we were just graduating into one of the world's worst recessions at the time. And my husband and I talked about maybe he should join the military and then we could go back to Europe. So he went to basic training, went to OCS. I followed him around for 20 years. We moved 18 times. And so the career kind of was a group decision.
That's really interesting. How did you feel this was going to affect your career when you first sort of adapted to the idea of, okay, I'm going to be a part of military life. I know this is going to mean me moving a lot. What did you think this would look like for your career in those moments?
Well, honestly, I didn't really think about that. I should have. But at that point, we were newlyweds. I had a little kid. I wasn't really thinking career, but in thinking back, I have worked the whole time he was in the military off and on, and I had to cobble together jobs. So for me, especially, I took a lot of volunteer work and put that onto a resume. And after a while, I discovered I had all these skills. And I went and got my alternate route certification for teaching while he was in the military. And then once we would move to every new assignment, I'd get a teaching job. And it was really hard because I was always the new teacher. I was always having to learn the new curriculum, have the principal scrutinize my teaching more because I was new. Then every couple of years we'd pack up and I'd have to move and learn a new curriculum and a new, way of teaching.
Can you talk a little bit about that volunteer experience? How did that inform the future work that you did?
Well, I would work for the Army Community Service, and I was volunteering at the library, teaching arts and crafts. And I did a summer camp in Charles County, teaching crafts. And pretty soon I realized I had quite a portfolio of teaching, and especially in recreation. And so that was kind of cool. When we were living in Puerto Rico, I actually got a really dream job. I was a guest lecturer for cruise lines based on my crafts experience. And so I could do a cruise as a guest lecturer and take a guest and for very cheap. And I'd work an hour a day and have a cruise out of it. I don't know if they still do that now, though. That was when we were living in Puerto Rico. I could just hop on the ship. But it seemed to me that all of the training, all of the planning of events and all of the, the spouses club events that I helped plan all kind of worked in my favor when I started looking at skills. Oh, I'm a project planner. Oh, I'm a freelance writer. Oh, I'm an artist. And so my resume on the USA job site, there's a spot in the resume builder where you can put volunteer work. And I have found that is a very helpful catch-all for skills. I volunteered as a chaplain for a while. Where do you put that on a resume? So It goes under volunteer. So I just found that really was helpful.
I think that's something that military spouses struggle with a lot, is this idea of, well, if I do have gaps in my resume, intentional or not, how do I kind of make up for that? Do you feel like volunteer work is a good opportunity to get that additional experience and have some more things on your resume?
Oh, I absolutely do. And also, it gives you an opportunity to do things you ordinarily wouldn't do. And it gives you confidence. It gives you a network. I don't think enough people really think about forming networks.
Mm, yeah. What advice would you have for a spouse who is looking to build a network? Where do you start with that?
Well, I think you should always put yourself out there when you have an event you go to. Go up to the guest speaker and introduce yourself. Take some notes. Get a card. Remember the person's name. I'm terrible with names. So when you get the card, get the name, maybe send an email. Thank you for speaking to the group today. When I was working, I worked in the federal sector for a long time. I started building a Rolodex of people, and I could always network with, I could always help somebody. I always felt that I was like the connector, so-and-so needs something, and I know so-and-so who can help them with that. And so I was always very free with my connections. I wasn't hoarding them like, oh, only I know this person. So I think really remembering names, writing down, maybe putting them into your phone, met them here, they do this, some tips on so you can remember what they do later and really share. I feel that if you put out into the universe will, treat you kinder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So you worked as a teacher. That's a very popular career, kind of in general, but especially in the military spouse community. What challenges, if any, did you experience being a military spouse and trying to work in a traditional education career?
I don't really think I had a whole lot of difficulty, except that I would have to learn the new curriculum. I wouldn't get to teach the same grade every year. And oh, actually, I didn't always keep up with my licenses. So, and I have licenses all over the place. So Maryland, Puerto Rico, Indiana, you name it. I have a license, and I let some of them lapse. And now, years later, decades later, I'm reconsidering going into teaching again. And I'm trying to organize my resume and my licenses. And so keep your licenses current for sure, because you may need that particular license, even if you're not teaching in that field right now. And the thing I found most difficult literally was having to learn this way of doing math or this way of doing science, or if I was teaching in a parochial school, their curriculums. But it kept me on my toes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Made me a better teacher.
Yeah, for sure. I can imagine adapting to all of those different environments and expectations and curriculum could be challenging, even though you're bringing over that same core set of skills. So if you had to give a piece of advice about working in education as a military spouse to other spouses, what would that be?
Well, teachers are always flexible. I would remind them, be flexible, enjoy it.
Awesome. Okay. So I know you run a museum now. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came into existence and how you came up with that idea?
So in 2010, my son was deployed to Iraq, and I was like every other military mom out there. It's different when your child goes and deploys than the spouse. And I was watching the TV and, hoping and praying he'd come back safely and he'd do a good job. And I realized that around the world, military moms and dads and spouses were concerned and praying and hoping that their loved one would come home, and that this was something that we all had in common as spouses and as parents. So I was just kind of wondering if there was any museum out there dedicated to the family perspective. I believe that in order to get a full picture of history, you need to see it from all sides. And so when I went on Google, I Googled military mom museums, military family museums, and I didn't see anything. So I thought, well, I'll start one. And being a teacher, it was kind of easy. It will be just like another social studies project. But 10 years later, it's so much more than a social studies project.
The Military Spouse Careers and Business Podcast is sponsored by Operation Freelance, a 501c3 teaching military spouses, caregivers, and veterans how to break into freelance work with our unique 90-day certification program. You'll get a community, support from a freelance mentor, review of all of your materials, including your pitch and work proposals and samples, all for free if you're accepted into our 90-day program, which currently runs twice per year. For more information and to get on the short list when we open applications, please visit www.operationfreelance.org. Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell me a little bit about what kind of the mission and the purpose behind the museum is?
Well, the first thing is we want to honor military families and preserve their legacies and share their stories and educate the public on what it's like to be a military family. So we tell the good, the bad, and the in-between. And we're an all-volunteer organization. And so all of us are board members and, we don't get paid. We are an inclusive hub for providing a community. So anyone who is nostalgic for military life or want to learn more about it, they can come to the museum. We're set up in a house, like an old house. And it's almost like walking into military housing, some of the older military housing. House that we're in was built in the 70s and it's got linoleum floors that are scuffed and you just multicolored paint on it. And so when you walk in, it's like, oh yeah. And so we have a living room and people just naturally come into the museum and plop on the couch and start talking and sharing stories. But our house museum is very experiential. You can open the cupboards and pull out coffee cups from different posts or bases. And so it's kind of immersive. And then we're also a special collections library. And so we've collected thousands and thousands of documents and letters and folios of stories. So our mission is to preserve the history because it's very hard to go back and see what it was like to be a military wife in the 40s, And so we're doing that. And we're kind of like the symbolic home for people who long for military life, but they can't go back there. For example, one of our co-founders lived right outside of the base that she grew up on, but she couldn't go in because, she didn't have an ID card anymore.
Yeah, there's all kinds of different challenges that I think there's such a community of spouses and families who know it because they've lived it, right? If it's your children or if your siblings, you kind of have an awareness of the military life. But outside of it, people don't think about it a lot. It always surprises me when I talk about how many times I've moved, and I only have moved half as many times as you. And people still go, wait, what? You guys moved 9 times? And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty standard over the course of somebody's military career. Like it almost becomes normal, right? But it's great that you're sharing those stories. Now, you're kind of like the first in a field that's doing something like this. It's always a hard position to be the first. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigate that?
So the first thing is that you have to start a nonprofit or a museum or anything with the mindset that it is a business. I mean, we did start it off as like, this will be a fun project, but, we were very slow. We didn't go out there, raise a lot of money and say, we're going to do this. We were very slow and cautious because we didn't want to get it wrong. And so we learned, for the first couple of years, the museum was online only. And so we had blogs and a gallery, and we did a lot of collaboration with other organizations, other museums in town. And that was wonderful in some ways because that collaboration got us out there doing exhibits and programming, and we built some, legitimacy and credibility. But what it also did was confuse our brand because when we started talking about getting a building, people would say, oh, you are with such and such a museum. I saw your program. You're fine. Why do you need a building? You're there. And I'm like, no, that was an exhibit. That wasn't that isn't permanent. So the other thing that we did, people kept saying, you need to get out there on social media. You need to get your brand out there. Went about it the wrong way. And so we had 10 separate blogs on different platforms and, different social media things. And that was confusing because it wasn't all tied together, even though we thought it made perfect sense. was more confusing. So people starting out now probably are laughing when they hear this, but social media was very new when we started it. But some of the other things, because we were the first, it was constantly a learning curve for us, the people doing it. I mean, none of us had museum experience. Most of us were federal employees and educators. So we had to really learn everything from the ground up and be willing to pivot. And that was good. But we also had to educate people. They're like, but there's a military museum down the street. Why aren't you there? Well, because we're not a military museum per se. We are a military family museum. And so that was constantly trying to explain who we are. And people kept saying, well, you're the spouses club, or you're the Blue Star Mothers, or you're the, So we had to come up with an elevator speech very quickly to just, like in 2 or 3, 20 seconds, say who we are, what we believe, what we're doing. And so the other thing that, as starting a museum, is when people donate artifacts to you, they're giving you something incredibly valuable to them. And it may not be monetarily valuable, but emotionally, it's priceless. And so we have to be careful, that we're treating it well, we're taking care of it, things like that. So anyone who starts a business, you need to think of it as a business, but you need to think about how you're going to grow and how you're going to sustain it. And also realize it takes a huge toll on you personally and your family. It's exhausting, to build something and then maintain it and then continue with it. And then, we're always pivoting and collaborating, and you need to stay relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I think one of the things that's hardest, I run a nonprofit that's sort of, the nonprofit arm of my business, Operation Freelance, where we help military spouses learn how to freelance. And I think at the beginning, there's so much momentum behind it. There's so much excitement. And one of the things that gets harder as time goes on is to keep that momentum going. And I'm sure with your museum, you were just talking about staying relevant. What are some ways that you make sure you are staying relevant for your intended audience?
Well, we have lots of programming, and a lot of our programming is drawn on what's going on in the world. So we do programming that's relevant. We publish books, so we do anthologies. We are always asking people to contribute stories. Until COVID, we're doing naturalization ceremonies at the museum. So people, veterans and military spouses, were getting their citizenship in our living room, in our kitchen. It was kind of cool. And we are always out there just interacting with the public. But one thing that we have is we started a veteran family community collaborative. And so that's kind of our think tank part of the museum. And so that is looking at issues that pertain mostly to rural veterans and their families, because our museum is out in the East Mountains of Albuquerque. It's 7 miles east, so it's out in a rural area. And so we did programming and town halls and tried to work with many helping organizations to kind of collaborate with them to improve our community. Because, a museum is not just a museum anymore. It's a community hub. It's a center. It's a place to hang out. It's a place for people to come and get resources. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's really impressive what you've built. And how has the pandemic affected sort of your programming and scheduling?
Yeah. Well, we closed. I think it was like March 13th of last year. We had our last naturalization ceremony, and then the museum closed. And it was shut and shuttered until about March of this year. And so what we did in that time is we had grants out to do programming already. So we had to spend the money. So we had to think about how to do this. And so we pivoted. We did online We did some online programming. I reached out to, some military spouses and said, hey, would you like to, teach a class, write a poetry class? We did town halls. We looked at some of the issues going on. How can people maintain sobriety during, the pandemic if they're not going to meetings? This was very early on. Of course, every helping agency pivoted as well, but we were doing some online, programming with the VA and with behavioral health. And so we did a lot of that. We started our own podcast. And so we put out, I think we've, had about 100 plus episodes. And we continued just doing things online, trying to engage our Facebook followers, continuing to add to the blogs that we have. And then I dabbled in a virtual exhibit about the University of Maryland, Munich, where I played around with Google Classroom, I think it is, and made kind of a little immersive online mini exhibit. And then, of course, our board is around the country. And so they were all doing things for the museum remotely as well. And we have some exciting programs we're working on right now.
I love it. You have so much going on, and it sounds like you've really been able to pivot and kind of find new ways to serve your audience, even when doing things in person wasn't possible. So where can listeners go to learn more about the museum?
Well, so they can look at us on Facebook. So if you go on Facebook, we're the Museum of the American Military Family. They can look at our website, which is www.militaryfamily.org. And our podcast is militaryfamilymuseum.podbean.com. And we would just love for people to check us out on Facebook. That's our most dynamic. The webpage is mostly our news and just a little bit more about our projects. We created a play. We've made movies. So, there's lots out there. There's lots out there. We military spouses can't, don't get pushed down. We just keep developing and changing and evolving and, pulling on our boots and marching forth.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Laura, for having me. It was fun.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. Our show is sponsored by Operation Freelance, a 501c3 nonprofit that helps military spouses, veterans, and caregivers break into freelance work. To learn more about that, visit www.operationfreelance.org. If you're looking to access show notes and more information about the guests you heard on today's show, please visit betterbizacademy.com.